I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London. Now, the first general election in Britain of 2017 has come and gone. Why do I say first? Well, not just because there may very well be another one in 2017. The pace at which things are moving in Britain, it could be literally any day that the British government is to fall. To paraphrase a Chinese saying, the Conservatives struggled mightily to lift a huge rock only to drop it on their own feet. Because, of course, the British general election of 2017 didn't have to happen at all. In fact, it would have been illegal for it to happen before 2020 if the Conservative government had not managed to scrap the law which they themselves introduced just a couple of years before to make sure that every parliament lasted 5 years. And they did so for nakedly opportunistic reasons. They thought that Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, was dead in the water. They believed the opinion polls carried out by companies very sympathetic to them and absolutely influenced by a mass media overwhelmingly sympathetic to them. They believed that the Labour leader could not possibly win a general election. And they called an election that they very nearly lost. They went into the election with a small parliamentary majority and came out without a parliamentary majority at all. Unless and until they managed to cobble together the most grotesque pantomime horse ever seen on the British political stage. And there's no prizes for guessing who's at the head of the horse and who's at, well, you know the rest of the metaphor. The Conservatives are currently threatening or promising to pave the streets of East Belfast in gold leaf, if only the most extreme Northern Irish Unionists will agree to a programme of government with them and keep them in power. And even if they do, the Conservative majority, even in that pantomime horse government, will be a mere two. Now, I spent almost 30 years sitting in the British Parliament, and I have seen Prime Ministers with majorities rather larger than two struggle very, very hard to try and remain in control of events. The John Major Conservative government was almost brought down with a majority, I think, in the 20s, maybe 25 or 27, because in politics there are always events. It's not one damn thing, as the Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan once said, it's one damn thing after another. And it's not that Britain is short of issues. The country has been rocked by a succession of shocking and unexpected events ever since the decision of the British people to go for Brexit, leaving the European Union. There has been one shock, one event after another. And the most recent, though not everyone in the world will be paying as close attention to this as we here in Britain are, is the incineration of perhaps hundreds of British people in a tower block in the richest borough of Britain, the royal borough of Kensington and Chelsea, sitting on £400 million worth of reserves, could not afford to put sprinklers in a tower block of 24 stories in height. They could not afford to install a fire alarm, and to save, and I'm not making this up, just £5,000, It's a borough, the richest borough, with hundreds of millions of pounds in the bank to save £5,000. They clad the tower block in noxious, cyanide, fume-giving, cheap cladding, which, when the fire took hold, then massacred what may turn out to be hundreds of people. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, was as hapless and hopeless in responding to that disaster as she proved to be during the course of the general election campaign. Jeremy Corbyn, quite well known to the viewers watching this, with a long record of almost 40 years of supporting freedom, liberation, justice, progress all over the world, turned out to be miraculous in the general election campaign and has become the toast of the town. He has become a celebrity that, frankly, as someone who's been his friend for many decades, I still have to pinch myself to prove that I'm not dreaming. At the Glastonbury Rock and Roll Festival, 200,000 young people who wouldn't have given tuppence for any other political figure were literally singing his name. He was the headline act, not the rock and roll stars that the organisers had paid so much money to bring to the festival. So Britain is on a knife edge. There's no doubt that the mood in the streets is angry, in some places even ugly. It may yet still be a long, hot summer for the British government, and we may be back discussing the next British general election of 2017 before very much longer. Of course, other possibilities exist. The Conservatives may cobble together a majority that lasts in Parliament. It may be that the Brexit negotiations takes everyone's mind off the question of who rules Britain and on to the question of what Britain's relationship will be to the European Union. It could be that other huge, grim, disastrous events occur. After all, we had 3 major terrorist attacks in Britain in 3 months, killing almost 50 people, hospitalizing many hundreds of people. Then we had the tower block fire. It's not beyond the realms of possibility by any means that political events will erupt that we can't imagine yet, but which may fundamentally influence the course of the events that are to come. I've assembled an audience of distinguished experts and 1 or 2 enthusiastic amateurs like me to discuss the issues that arise from the British general election. And Charles Shoebridge, my old expert friend, he's up first to discuss his view. Go ahead, Charles.
Hello, George. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, it's been a shock for a lot of people, but a lot of people didn't think actually it was a shock. For example, people like myself, I really wish I'd put money on my prediction of a hung parliament that I put out, because exactly what you were saying, that the so-called pundits, the media, and all of those that are paid so much to predict events and thereby, of course, influence events and complete the circle of influencing and predicting and so on, of course, had their interests in predicting that Corbyn would do very badly, including, it must be said, within Corbyn's own Labour Party, where he still, I think, has enemies. But it was interesting for me from the security perspective how terrorism seemed to change the dynamic of the discourse during the election campaign, because it was happening simultaneous with the campaign, but in a way that I think that many people wouldn't have predicted. After all, we have a Conservative Party that at its bedrock likes to say that it is the party of law and order. It is the party upon which people can depend when times are tough. This is their own propaganda, repeated by the media, large parts of the media anyway, over many, many years. But what the terrorist attacks seemed to do was give Jeremy Corbyn an opportunity, quite rightly, to take it and say, I am going to discuss security because people are dying. It must be an election issue, despite the fact that the Conservatives and so on and the media tried to play it down as an election issue. Corbyn made it an election issue because our security should be an election issue.
Of course.
People are dying and being mutilated and maimed, and it may go on in the future. And he asked the crucial question, which many of us, yourself, myself, and many people over the years, including him, have been asking, but hasn't been getting much media attention, is why is this terrorism happening? And furthermore, what can we do to prevent or reduce the incidence of it happening in the future? And he made the connection, which many of us have done before, to foreign policy. Corbyn actually said, we need to look at the causes of this. This isn't to excuse the terrorism, absolutely not. And it isn't to say we're not going to punish those responsible and even eradicate them if that's what's necessary by killing them on the streets. What Corbyn has said during the election campaign, and this is so unusual in an election that foreign policy or defence policy even emerges as an issue, Brexit aside, even less that the parties, the three main parties, have any kind of non-consensual view on this. Foreign policy, as you know, is very rarely an election issue because it's not made an issue by the media. They all have the same consensus. And Corbyn has made the point repeatedly and brought it up in the context of these terrorist attacks by saying, has our foreign policy made the situation worse? Have we destabilised countries that then become safe havens for terrorists? And we can see, all the experts nowadays agree on this, that places such as Libya, Syria, Iraq, of course, these are the incubators for groups such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on. And also, of course, when we think back to all the terrorist attacks that have taken place before Manchester, because we don't know we haven't heard yet what the correct motive or the full motivation was for the Manchester attacker and the two London attackers. But what we do know is that every attack that has taken place in Britain before that time, we know that the motivation for those people, or the stated motivation at least, was revenge, a retribution for Britain and America killing people in what they call their countries. We know this because the people, for example, those that killed Lee Rigby in the streets in Woolwich, people like them said this was the reason at their trial. Other people, like the 7/7 bombers, they killed innocent people, including Muslims, on the streets. They said it was because of our foreign policy. They said it in their suicide videos. And so there shouldn't really be any dispute about this subject in terms of the impact of our foreign policy on producing this kind of instability and terrorism. That's not to say it's the only reason. It's a complex subject. But Corbyn is the first person as a major politician, and especially in an election campaign, to bring that up. And lo and behold, within a couple of days, some opinion polls were showing that upwards of 75% of people, including a majority of Tory voters, agreed with Corbyn's position on this. Then, of course, it quickly disappeared from the media. But I think that it may well, therefore, have been a factor that rather than actually encouraging people to vote Conservative, the so-called party of law and order, that incidentally, of course, has cut police, firefighters and so on to the bone, and therefore affected the response to these incidents, as well as the intelligence gathering mechanisms on the street that might help to prevent these incidents happening. But I really do think that many people actually thought, actually, we agree with what Corbyn says here. I noticed the Daily Mail, for example, the Bible, if you like, of the voting Tory fraternity, to put it that way. They, when Corbyn started saying that these wars may have some contribution to it, to start with, they didn't cover it because they know full well that many of their readers oppose this position too of our foreign policy destabilising countries, causing or provoking or encouraging terrorism on our streets. And then, of course, the opinion polls started to show that actually people agreed with him. So it may well be that some people actually saw, here's a person providing an alternative. That's not to say other issues are not important, like the NHS, education, and so on. But the terrorism aspect seemed to galvanise a segment of population that isn't normally represented in the political process. And for the first time, we saw foreign policy and terrorism being discussed not as some boring consensus, but as somebody who's saying something different, and which, for many of us, is self-evidently true.
Here, here, indeed. Not many predicted, including me, and I'm quite good at predictions, that after the terrorist atrocity in Manchester, that the Prime Minister would utterly fail in weaponizing that disaster, that great crime, in her favor. I believed that the Prime Minister, with the media on her side, would successfully turn the debate in the election away from domestic issues to Jeremy Corbyn's supposed links, that's the words they used, to international terrorism. Words like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Irish Republican Army, and so on were tossed around so vehemently by right-wing journalists and politicians that it seemed to me inevitable that though Corbyn had done very well up to that point, he would be bound now to start falling in the polls. But he had the courage to do as you say. Perhaps he had no alternative, but I believe that he had the courage to face this issue square and say, it's you who cut the police, it's you who cut the fire services, it's you who allowed these terrorists into the country, and above all, it's you who supported the wars, invasions, and occupations that have filled a giant swamp of hatred outside of this country and out of which some of these monsters are crawling. It may be the first time, actually, anywhere, that a right-wing government seeking to make a khaki uniformed election has so utterly failed in its expectation. Please come back on me.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely, and I think that's because once again you've got a situation where the mainstream media, on the left and the right, because the Guardian is, for example, is up there with the Daily Mail in supporting an interventionist foreign policy, in supporting government propaganda that galvanizes the public into supporting, at least temporarily, these foreign adventures, and of course opposed Corbyn wholeheartedly until he became successful, and now they all support him, of course.
Now they're singing his name at Glastonbury.
Absolutely. Very middle-class Glastonbury, we should say as well, probably, to a large degree, if you've seen the price of the tickets. But in respect of his intervention, and we say his intervention, I mean, his intervention, it's his job to intervene, talking about issues. He produced or mentioned an alternative narrative, and it's one that governments and the media have not realised that their readership and their publics actually subscribe to. And that narrative is that these wars have not done us any good. They've killed a lot of civilians overseas. They have killed a lot of British service people. They have produced no stability. They have produced no democracy. I say these things because these were the premises upon which these adventures were sold to us by a very, very enthusiastic media, almost none of whom ever go off and fight, nor do their children. And of course that applies to most of our politicians too.
Yes. Charles, it's not just that Corbyn faced up the media and the political class, it's that there is now actually beginning to be a vast development of alternative media outside the mainstream. And one of the most important, significant, I told you last time he was on the show, one day he's going to be real famous. He's sitting right next to you, Steve Topple. Steve, to what extent did alternative media play a role in what to most people is a very surprising election result?
George, you're far too kind. Your introduction was lovely, thank you. I think the independent and alternative media played a big role. I write for a website called The Canary, and we saw our statistics absolutely shoot through the roof during the election campaign period. We moved up to the 228th most viewed website in the UK. We're above Reuters, we're above Huffington Post, we're above The Spectator, The New Statesman, The Economists. And I think there's now a growing appetite for it because you can't get away from it. So many people use social media. 16% of people get the news from Facebook now, and alternative news is featured heavily on the likes of Facebook and Twitter, so it is in people's faces. But I think it's deeper than that. I think we're continuing to see this backlash, if you like, against the establishment. We've seen it in France, which I know we're going to discuss later, although they have elected essentially a centrist Blairite politician. It's going against the previous socialist government that was in. We've seen it in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn. We saw it in 2015 as well with the surge of the Green Party and UKIP. There is still that feeling that the political political class has somehow betrayed everyone, and they are now, people are now looking for an alternative voice, if you like, and the new media is providing that. But still, there is the dominance of the mainstream media that cannot be shied away from, if you like. We still have the BBC controlling the majority of the news, although the likes of Russia Today, RT, are gaining prominence with a television channel. But it's getting there. It's slowly getting there. I think that did play a big factor in changing the discourse and changing the debate during the general election period.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a synonym, of course, but age and the likelihood of you consulting other media are related. There are exceptions. I'm one of them. I was ahead of the curve on social media. I've got more than 1 million followers on social media. But that's not normal. Someone my age is not normally as into alternative social media as me. But young people are overwhelmingly into it. And the younger you are, the less likely you are to look anywhere else other than alternative media, because you simply don't believe what you see on the mainstream. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that reflected in the demographics of the election turnout. Majority of people who voted for Labour were under 50s. Labour had the majority there. Labour had the majority in the BAME community. 18 to 24-year-olds, I think the turnout was 54%, which was huge for a general election. That's a record turnout, I believe. And so it's reflected in the way people voted. And I think the more that continues, the Tories still have the over 50s in their pocket, if you like, even though they were promising the now defunct, that the Tories have abandoned dementia tax, which was so heavily rotated in the media. The elderly generation still voted for them.
We'll be right back with more of this. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Television, coming to you from London, discussing the recent elections in Britain and, for that matter, later in the show, in France. We took the كلمة camera onto the streets of London to hear what some of the people thought. Take a look at this.
Do you think the recent terror attacks in UK and France had an effect on the election results?
No, I don't really think so, because it was going before that happened, would it? Before the election result, the terrorists always been about.
I would think so in this country, at least, but it's really hard to say, because people have been afraid of sort of terror attacks for a while now, right? So it's hard to say that those couple of incidents actually had an effect.
Do you think the recent terror attacks that happened in the UK and France before the elections had an effect on the results, election results?
No, I don't think so. I think people have more sense than that.
Yeah, I do think to a certain extent, yeah, people are, the election campaign did have a lot to do with it in terms of immigration, and then the terrorist attacks kind of feed it into that.
People in France and the UK still didn't vote for the far right. As we can see in France, the far right didn't win, and the Conservatives here, they've lost votes, they've lost seats. So do you think the fear of terrorism has lost its power in these countries?
Usually when in France they vote for the far right, it's just to show what they are unhappy with the government. But surely the far right will never win.
They didn't win a majority, but a lot of that was from the young people and the views from young people. The idea that young people have a more liberal way of thinking, and they perhaps don't follow what the media say. They can maybe read up online, talk to people more. Whereas a lot of the conservative voters, they've been conservative for a very long time, so they have their particular views, and that's kind of engraved in them. Whereas I think young people are more open to opinions and hearing people and that kind of thing.
Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? Because although almost all of those vox pops were contradictory, there was something that was correct in every one of them, basically. Except, here's a paradox. In Britain, the young people voted left. In France, the young people voted right. The demographic of the vote for Le Pen, and indeed the membership of the Front National in France, is actually the other way round. which is why the fascists in France have some hopes for the future, and why Labour in Britain has even more hope for the future, a kind of reverse demographic point that maybe we'll come to. Now, another of the young coming men and women in the alternative media is Matt Turner from Evolve Politics. You were among those who did predict the hung parliament, and you were, I remember, quite widely ridiculed by right-wing journalists like Dan Hodges in The Telegraph for so doing. How did you get it right?
Well, it's funny because on the morning of the general election result, Andrew Marr said on TV, nobody saw this coming. And I said, you should talk to some of the people in this audience maybe, because all of us predicted it. I think that the result that we saw was predictable. I think that the mainstream commentators who were ridiculing myself and others, I'm sure Steve and people at Novara Media, the canary of our politics, had similar smarmy tweets sent at them. I think they're the ones who are living in a bubble. And that accusation was often made at sites like Evolve Politics and the Canary, that we are living in a Labour Party bubble and we're not reflective of the attitude on the ground. Now, if anything, it shows that they are incredibly out of touch with what is happening on the ground at the moment. Now, it brings into question, what are they for anymore? You know, I don't think that... I think we're at the vanguard of something new. Myself and Steve and the Canary, Evolve Politics, we will soon be the new mainstream. I think if you look at the way that we've grown over the last 6 months, it's been absolutely staggering, especially when it comes to the general election month, in the month of May. Evolve Politics received 1.3 million unique hits and had a Facebook reach of about 17 to 20 million, which is people who've at least seen our content, if not clicked on it. Now, that's absolutely huge. It outweighs a lot of the mainstream media coverage, which you do occasionally get on your news feeds. We are saturating the market right now, and that market has been opened up by the sheer lack of balance in the mainstream media. People want journalism that lights a fire in their belly now, and the mainstream media have really never done that. Sites like Evolve Politics, we offer something new. We offer a journalist and activist dynamic. We give a voice to those marginalised issues that are often omitted from the mainstream press. Now, the argument often made by the mainstream was that these issues weren't in the national interest, so they didn't report them. But if they weren't, then why are sites like the Canary and Evolve Politics doing so well?
Well, who defines the national interest? And of course, who will guard the guards is the most famous of all questions. One group of people, it seems to me, are uniquely distrusted now. And I'm kind of old, but not that old. But I lived in a time when the BBC was the most respected institution, along with the National Health Service, in the whole country, and was widely respected in many other parts of the world too. And I've lived long enough to now live in a time where the BBC is amongst the most reviled of all the media organizations, its reputation in tatters. Do you agree with that?
Yes, definitely. The BBC is in crisis because they are purging viewers to both the left and the right, not in a kind of dissimilar way to how politics is operating at the moment. There's an interesting parallel between politics and the media. What once was the majority centre ground, they're purging votes to the left and to the right. So now the coverage which they are giving is not actually representative of the full population. Now, Evolve Politics have made a big point of writing articles slamming BBC bias, but we always cite academic sources, reports, or even the BBC Trust themselves, who said that Laura Kuenssberg's shoot-to-kill comments on Corbyn were woefully inaccurate. I can't see it getting any better for the BBC right now.
Well, no, and it's compounded by the fact, isn't it, that you're forced to pay for the BBC. You get sent to prison if you don't pay your annual fee to the BBC. That's why I'm much more angry at them than at any normal capitalist media outlet, because at least I'm not forced to pay for Mr. Murdoch and Sky. But I'll go to prison if I don't pay, and I'll go to prison for a long time if I encourage you and you not to pay the BBC license fee. Now let's turn to France, if we may. The outcome in the French election was, of course, much more decisive. The second round of the presidency delivered pretty much a landslide victory for the entirely new, but entirely old at the same time, centrist vision of Macron. And the parliamentary elections, which have just concluded, have produced an actual landslide based on a very low turnout for Macron. So he now has absolute power in France. The fantastic vote that your candidate and mine, Mr. Mélenchon, got melted like snow in the parliamentary elections. I think you'll tell me if I'm wrong, they now have a mere handful of members in the parliament, despite getting more or less 20% of the vote for the presidency. And France is only a few miles from here. For those watching from far away, you could almost throw a stone. You could certainly swim from England to France, and many people do. But the politics is so very different. Please.
Yes, so the way I'm going to describe the French political system at the moment, you're right that Macron, he won the elections, and same thing for the legislative elections, so it was very well calculated. I think that Mélenchon did well. He started from scratch, and if you look at the younger generation, you've got lots of people who voted for him. He's more supported by the youngsters. And Macron, you're right that he's a centrist, and he's from the right. We don't know exactly. Sometimes he was in a socialist government. But I think that he's also supported by lots of, and if you look at the people working with him in his team, you've got lots of people who are new in politics. So there's a big change. So what I understand, and this is what I was saying, the reason why Marine Le Pen was so high in the opinion polls was because lots of people wanted to vote for the National Front, not because they supported the ideas of Marine Le Pen, but just because they wanted to get rid or to bring the system to its knees. So with Macron, what he's doing now, I think that's very important for us to give him the time and see exactly what he's going to do. I would have preferred Mélenchon, but Macron now, there are some few changes. One is there are more ethnic minorities in his team, which is very important. Women are very well represented.
Half, isn't it? Half
yes,
of the MPs.
Which is something new. He got rid of all the people who had been in politics for years. And recently, it was last week, lots of ministers had to resign just because they had some judiciary issues. So that is something very important, And so I'm telling myself that we are going to give him the time to see what he's doing, what he's going to put into place. For sure, I think the way he's starting is better than Hollande. Not like the type of politics I like, but he's starting better than Hollande.
And his foreign policy in the first couple of weeks is better than Hollande's also.
Yes.
He, for example, in his démarche on Syria,
Definitely.
in the last days, more or less declared France's involvement in the war in Syria over, and the result, a clear defeat.
Yeah, there's something I was saying in 2007. I defended a PhD with the Sorbonne University in 2007, and it was about Britain and the integration of ethnic minorities in Britain. It was more the Muslim community I was looking at. And I was saying this. One of the points I was saying was that if you want to have a very good, let's say, system of integration in Britain, you've got to be very careful with the foreign policy. You cannot go to some countries, bomb the people there and expect good social cohesion at home. So that was very important. And I was saying this in 2007 in France in my PhD. So I successfully defended my PhD, but it seems that because of this message I sent in France, I'm put a bit aside now.
Well, it's their loss. We have you here now in England.
I'll just say one more thing.
Go on, Charles.
But talking about the difference between the result in France and the United Kingdom, they are different, of course, because they've produced different results, as I say, outcomes. But there is something in common, and that is, it comes back to something that a friend here said as well, and that is that in many ways these are a reaction against the pre-existing government. The Conservative government, I mean, technically, of course, it won the election, but in all other senses, it, of course, lost because, of course, it lost in Britain its a small majority. And, of course, the Labour Party, Corbyn, who offered an alternative to what we've had for the last few years, massively increased his vote. And this vote in France is also, of course, if we look back not just to the current round, but also the first round, it is a massive rejection of Hollande and his policies.
And indeed of the Conservatives.
Exactly.
In France, both Labour and the Conservatives were rejected. The election was fought between the far right and an entirely new centrist force. It would be like a British general election in which neither Labour or the Conservative Party were in the running to form the government. That's quite a remarkable change.
And when you get young people who are comprising quite a large proportion of the electorate, as they were this time, which is, of course, a very positive development, the increase in the turnout with young people in the UK. And then in France, they're still voting, as they did here, to reject the order that is actually in place. So there is that element that is common, I guess.
Well, we'll look in the next segment to what extent it is a change, or if I can try my schoolboy French, plus ça change, mais plus la même chose. We'll be right back. Still watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, in London for Al Mayadeen Television, discussing the, in a way, surprising results on both sides of what we call the English channel, inevitably, in Britain and in France. We took the camera out into the streets of London to poll the people. Let's hear what more of them said.
Do you think the UK should have another election?
Soon? Probably yes.
Yeah, 100%. Because we want Labour to win. Like, we go uni as well, so obviously I think most students would have voted Labour for like the free tuition fees.
She called the shot, she called the election, she didn't make it. So why should she get another shot?
Whoever gets voted in is getting their chance at that particular time. I mean, we'll ever go, and some people don't like always certain governments getting in, but you get a lot of people who sit on the sidelines, moan about it and don't vote.
So should the UK have another election?
Why not?
Do you think it should?
I think so.
Perhaps. Maybe. Yeah. Since the results were so different from the ones that were not too long ago, also, it just keeps changing back and forth, it seems. So, maybe.
Are we heading to a united or a divided Europe?
It's a bit hard to tell at the moment. I'm sort of sitting on the fence in terms of which way it's going to go.
Well, it's just one country living. There is still 27 left.
Do you think we're heading to a united or a divided Europe?
It will always be united, and then there will be just the wrong prime minister will divide it.
I'm not so sure how united Europe is, whether Britain leaves or doesn't leave. The people in Greece or Spain and Portugal, where I've just been, hate the European Union because it has smashed their living standards with its neoliberal orthodoxy and squeezing them till there was no blood left. Macron, on the other hand, was heavily backed by the EU and by Chancellor Merkel from Germany, and the EU is regarding the French result as a bit of a triumph. Are they wrong to do that? Oughtn't they to consider that 20% of the people voted for Mélenchon, 22% voted for Le Pen, there's 42% voting for two presidential candidates absolutely hostile to the EU?
Yes, this is, we could think like this, but I think what is very important for French people, they do not despise the European Union. It's just the way the European Union was constructed. This is what they are against. And I think that the role of Macron now is going to be to find solutions to maybe reform the European Union the way it is going. I think that he is going to be tough in the negotiations with Britain. So this is because we've got a hung parliament in Britain, so this is a position of weakness. And regarding France, French are not opposed to the European Union. They just want the European Union to be in their interests. That's it. That's very, because if you look at the European Union, it is France. It started with two countries, France and Germany, roughly. And Germany lost the Second World War, and it is from the Second World War that they decided to have this big organization so that there would be no more wars in the European continent.
France, of course, blocked Britain's first attempt to join the European Union, which many British people thought a little churlish, as well. I don't want to talk about the war.
I think that if you look for the French, the European Union belongs to them. They should be at the head of this organization, and all the other countries should be following. So you've got this competition with Germany, but that's it. They are just competing with the Germans.
Steve, to what extent, you heard some of those young people saying, absolutely, we need another general election. We want Labour to win. Although their caveat was that it was for the scrapping of university tuition fees and the writing off of student debt, which Jeremy Corbyn very boldly proposed. But it's not inevitable that there will be another general election, is it? It's probably more or less inevitable that Theresa May will be replaced by another Conservative Prime Minister, though even that is not inevitable. But it's still difficult to win a motion of no confidence in Westminster that will trigger another general election. So it may be that Jeremy has to go around the Glastonbury circuit more than once.
Yeah, I mean, if I was a betting man, I'm not sure I would put money on one being this year. But I think what you said in your opening was quite correct. We are hanging on the knife edge, if you like, with this. Theresa May has such a small majority that one false-footed move by her could bring the whole thing crashing down. And also, she's relying on these weasels in the Democratic Unionist Party, who, and I personally wouldn't trust as far as I could throw them, and I'm sure you wouldn't. It is teetering, if you like. But there is something else which comes into this, of course. We have a system in the UK of English votes for English laws, which means that the Scottish National Party, the Welsh Plaid Cymru and the DUP will not be able to vote on separate issues either. So we have to add that into the mix. But I think there's a bigger point to be made with this, and that is Theresa May has abandoned many of her manifesto pledges.
Almost all of them.
Yeah, which immediately calls into legitimacy of her government straight away, because people elect a government in this country on a manifesto, and she just took it and thrown the whole lot in the bin, fundamentally. And I think that's going to be a big challenge for her. But I do agree with you, she'll be out 6 months tops, I give her. I mean, if you look at the way even her own press, The Spectator, for example, came out against her quite vehemently in the last few days of the election. George Osborne, the former Chancellor, at the helm of the Evening Standard, they were vitriolic as well in their criticism of her and her almost presidential campaign, if you like. So I think her days are numbered. A general election, I'm not so sure.
That's also my analysis. Dr. James, where do you stand on this? Election soon, and what are the prospects of change in Britain? In
well, I think it depends on some kind of either cataclysmic event. I can't.
Which do come along with increasing frequency,
yes,
don't they?
Yes, they do. Or it could be an event such as the one we've just been, on the media that we've just been hearing from, which can be cataclysmic in a low-key sort of way. But it would need something like the revelation that I don't know whether people know about this Coudenhove-Kalergi plan for Europe. If that gets revealed as being a plan for not only reducing global population, but of reducing Europe to a sort of vassal state run by the 12 or so men who run the world, who are so wealthy that they're above the Forbes 500 list. They're not listed in the Forbes 500 list. 3 of them, I'm afraid I have to say again, are Rothschilds. George Soros is there, all the big names, the Rockefellers and so on. Now, if those families, which we've got more wealth than half the rest of the world put together, have got a sway in our future, they could easily, especially with somebody like Macron in France, change the way that we're dictated to. But if we found out, if the public found out that that kind of dictatorship had been planned and is being instituted, there would be a kind of revolution. Maybe it would only be an online revolution against it.
An online revolution is an unusual concept, I must say. I'm not sure how it disarms the ruling class online. Madam at the front.
Hi, my name is Mahbadawi. I just want to talk about the general elections. I absolutely think we should take another revote on the elections because Theresa May has taken no action to what's been happening in London. And I just want to talk about the tower block that got set on fire. She hasn't taken any actions in that situation. She only came but didn't at least meet the people that lost their homes, have no food, clothing. Also, the people that have money and stuff, they did so hard to get food for the people that lost their homes, get blankets for them, clothing, shoes, and they're quite supportive. And I'm quite surprised that the Queen went and visited the people that were in hospital. And
well, the Queen was probably the only person who got quite a good reception from the public.
Yeah, I agree.
Perhaps because people felt that her intentions were sincere. Jeremy Corbyn got a very good response from the public when he went there, but Theresa May got a very bad response. Perhaps because people instinctively felt that her intentions were not good. The current mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, did not get a good reception. But the Queen was cheered to the echo, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, Steve?
I think the debate surrounding Grenfell Tower and what happened there has... It's not opened up a can of worms as such, but it's really brought home to roost, if you like, the entrenched class divides that exist in this country. The debate has been now very mainstreamed about how the poor and the underclass are viewed by the political establishment. But it's also been noticeable that they've tried to now shift it back to just surrounding social housing, whereas in the UK we have this historic mindset and this historic issue, if you like, that the poor are somehow inferior to the establishment class. And I mean, it goes back to feudal times, you see it in Victorian times, you saw it after the First and Second World War, and this attitude that poor people are less deserving, if you like, it's still ingrained in society. And I think Grenfell Tower has thrown that into really, really sharp perspective. What's interesting about that is if you look at the demographics of the general election, majority of working class people voted Tory. Again, it's back to what I said earlier about you go to the ballot box and you vote for a smack in the face. There still seems to be an issue with both new media like myself and Matt being able to break through and make working class people realise that voting for Conservative is not what people should be doing because you are voting for your own demise, ultimately.
I have spent myself half a century struggling against that false consciousness, but I was on television last night with Larry King, the iconic American broadcaster, and he kind of floored me with a question of why do working class people, even poor people, vote for a government that cares nothing for them and is likely to leave them poorer than they were already. And it's never a good look to say on television, because they're stupid, But that is the bottom line on it, really. It is a stupid decision to make for someone with no money to vote for a party that only cares for people who have got money. Am I being cruel?
I'd agree with you it's a stupid decision, but I disagree, and I don't think you're saying this anyway, but anyone who does think it, that it's because working class people are stupid. It's not. I think the reason working class people, especially in those on council estates, vote for right-wing Conservatives governments is that their lives are so consumed with other things. And it's the very nature of capitalist society, if you like. Working class people are consumed by having to scrape by every day, going to work. If you're on benefits, a constant threat of having your money sanctioned and stopped, raising children. You don't have the mental capacity, and I know this because I live on a council estate, you don't have the mental capacity to take in and involve yourself in politics in the same way that people who have more mechanisms, if you like, to be able to do that. And therefore, you grab snippets of information from the mainstream news. You get your news from the BBC. You get it from headlines as you go into the shop to buy 20 cigarettes or whatever. And that is as far as you go. And therefore, politics is a fleeting moment, which you know affects you, but you do not have the capacity and the time to take it in. That's my view.
Very interesting. Yes, madam.
Hello, my name is Nicola Jeffrey. I also feel that the problem...
Nicola, I tell you what, hold that thought, because I got to take a break, and we'll come right back to you. We'll be right back.
عن تونس ما بعد الثورة وتحديات الحكومة والمعارضة في معالجة تراكم الأزمات. وعن الوفد البرلماني التونسي وزيارة الدعم العربي لدمشق الصامدة ومواقع انتصار محور المقاومة من قلعة حلب المحررة إلى صيانة سفوح القلمون. مباركة الإبراهيمي المناضلة والنائبة في البرلمان التونسي في حوار الساعة يأتيكم في الأوقات التالية.
This is كلمة on Al Mayadeen Television with me, George Galloway, coming from London. Last segment now, I want to get through as many of the talking heads that have come here as possible. Nicola.
Hello, my name's Nicola Jeffrey, and just touching on what Steve was just saying, I think a lot of the problem within this country, personally, I think classism is at the root of this, and we was just discussing why working class people are so disengaged. I think actually what a lot of it is the fact that there is no knowledge, there is no education, there is no access, there is no social mobility for somebody like myself from a council estate brought up on benefits to ever be able to actually have a voice within the political system. And I think what's changed, and that we've seen this across Europe, is the fact that we now have the invention of social media. It allows everybody and anybody to be able to communicate. I think it's given people the opportunity to be able to connect with people they wouldn't otherwise have had an opportunity to have connected with. And as a result, I think people have actually woken up to the two-tier system that we have across the globe that is inevitably run by the 12 families that we know. And I think this over time is starting to come to the surface, and I think that's why in these elections we're seeing the original two-tier systems collapse. And I think actually it's the political structure itself that is collapsing on a global scale.
The political class is, of course, far reduced in its levels of credibility for most people. But the General Election 2017 saw the largest percentage voting either Labour or Conservative of any election in recent times. The Liberal Democrats down, the Nationalists down, the Leftists down. The two-party system is back in Britain. There's no UKIP, there's no Greens, There's no socialists. Well, Jeremy Corbyn and Labour are the socialists.
Whilst I agree with you currently and on a mainstream perspective,
Level, yeah.
that's what we see. I think the bigger point to that is to do with proportional representation and our voting system itself within the country. A lot of people wanted to vote for Jeremy Corbyn, but people like myself, we were not voting for Corbyn, we were voting for our local MP, which was actually a Blairite candidate.
Very difficult dilemma,
Would very comfortably socially cleanse my council estate. So it concerns me that proportional representation is something that's not being addressed, and we are then left with the only two choices, a right punch or a left punch, basically.
What a very good phrase. I wish I had said that. Madam.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mrs. Farida Hamaizia, and I would like to talk about the election, the French elections, mainly about Macron, President Macron. Well, we have to bear in mind that he used to work as a banker for the Rothschild family, and this is very important. This could normally raise questions about his viability and, so this is the point I wanted to make.
Okay. No, that the President of France is a banker doesn't come as any surprise to me. Gentleman at the back.
Hi there, George. I just wanted to discuss the long-term drift in Britain has been, over the last 30 years, basically since Thatcher, has been a drift towards applauding the American model, the American dream model for capitalism, to be ashamed to be working class, to live in a council estate.
Travel on a bus.
Travel on a bus. Yeah. You'd have to be behind the wheel of your own car. And what we've seen happen is the American mindset is that you're not poor, you're just a temporarily inconvenienced millionaire. There's something to be ashamed of. Whereas in Britain, the social cohesion has broken down so that you have this two-track system. You will have two tower blocks in the same part of London. One will have sprinklers fitted to it. One will not have sprinklers fitted to it. What they will do to the one without sprinklers is to put on the current equivalent of stone cladding, which makes the building theoretically look nicer, but it's turned it into a death trap. This wouldn't happen in an equivalent block of the same height that was built for a Russian billionaire or to occupy 2 days a year. But the whole culture shift within Britain has been to lionize and to value the 2 days a year that the Russian billionaire, the Malaysian billionaire will spend in London. These people are put on a pedestal, set apart and more valued than the people that live in London all year round. And I think what's brought the country together, particularly in light of the election result, and it was typified by Theresa May's dash into a meeting to meet the police and dash away from it, and Corbyn's walking to meet the members of the public that were there, is that it's signified perhaps an end or perhaps a real serious turn in the road for capitalism.
Yes, one hopes so. I only enter this caveat to what you say, most of which I agree with, is that the Russian billionaire doesn't have a vote. And therefore, the politicians ought not to actually be worried about him at all. They ought to be worried about the many thousands of people who are not Russian billionaires but do have votes. You see, Nicola made the point about, or I paraphrase, about the voiceless. They may be voiceless, but they're not voteless. If they voted, they'd have more power than a Russian billionaire. Question is how to get them voting, and how to get them voting in the right way. And if I had the answer to that, well, hey, I'd be Prime Minister myself. Gentleman in the middle.
I noticed how the likes of Owen Smith and Hilary Benn and all the other traitors.
We better explain who they are for the international audience. Not many people even in Britain.
They were members.
These were the Blairite, anti-Corbyn fifth column inside Labour.
Yeah, who said that Labour had no chance of, and they were going to lose it with Corbyn and tried to oust him as leader. And now they are taking it all back and saying that they got it wrong and he surprised them. Did you believe that? How genuine do you believe that they're withdrawal of those statements are. And also, as long as this next election is not so imminent and they have enough time, do you think they'll continue the backstabbing and still try to maybe have another leadership contest?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn is untouchable, unsackable for the moment. But of course, a week is a long time in politics. And now that we have social media, a day or even an hour can be a long time in politics. So you can never say never or always in political life. Jeremy is 68 years old. If the next election is not for 5 years, that makes him 73, which in the United States is a young leader, but in Britain would be a leader almost as old as Winston Churchill when he became Prime Minister for the last time at the age of 81. So there's a kind of gap there, not a gap year, but a gap 5 years that are going to have to be filled, and we'll have to see what happens in those. As this is for an international audience, let me be entirely frank, in a way that I might not for diplomatic reasons be on the British media. I wouldn't trust these MPs as far as I could throw them. These people who spent the last 2 years trying to destroy Corbyn, trying to refloat the Blair boat, have not experienced a Damascene conversion. They may now be taking their hats off to Jeremy Corbyn and seeking to get back on the Labour front bench from which they all resigned one by one, every hour on the national news, each hour, in order to try and bring him down. But I don't believe for 1 minute that they are sincere. And I know Jeremy Corbyn very well. He's a more saintly person than me. He may believe that some of them are genuine, in which case I caution him to be very careful in that regard. There are people in labour movement politics, which I joined this year, 50 years ago. There are people who quite like the ideas that Jeremy was putting forward, but didn't believe that such ideas could ever be electorally popular in a country like Britain. And there are others in Labour politics who don't actually believe in those politics in the first place. Even if you could get people to vote for them, they would not, because they profoundly disagree with them. And thus, there's a difference amongst what might be quite right-wing Labour people, but who nonetheless, now that Jeremy has shown that actually you can make these policies very popular indeed, you can get more than 12 million people voting for them, you can increase Labour's vote more than it's ever increased since 1945, the end of the Second World War. There may be some of those who can be won. But the frontline Blairite leaders who've led the revolt against Corbyn over the last 2 years, I wouldn't trust them at all. Yeah, gentleman in the green shirt in the middle there. Yes, you, sir, with the sunglasses nattily arranged.
I just wanted to come back to the point where we asked why people from the working class vote for parties who don't really care about them. I really believe that many people from the working class know what's going on around them, and they just want to give their voice and give each party a chance. So they don't really believe that the government doesn't care about them as much as it's not really fair. I mean, nothing can be perfect. They sure get some benefits, but at the same time, they're not really happy about it.
Well, of course, I understand that, and people in a democracy are entitled to vote any way that they please. It's not for me to dictate to other people how they should vote. But if you say to me that an old person should rationally vote for a party that has just told them it's going to take their house away to pay for their care in their old age. Or a young person at university should vote for a party that has tripled their university tuition fees, will increase the university tuition fees more, and wouldn't dream of writing off the student debt, that you can rationally make a case for such a student to vote for them. I say no. If you're an old person, you should vote for the government that isn't going to take your house away. If you're a young person, you should vote for the party that isn't going to charge you anything at all to go to university. That's logic and rational thinking to me.
Well, just before the election, every party has on entering that, well, they really promise something to change, and these people believe them. So even though there's the party that will take their house away, there's the other one who promise changes, and they vote for them. So
yeah, no, I take that point. There's a credibility gap based on the previous history, and that is a logical and rational suspicion that people have, that, well, politicians always make promises, but they don't always keep them. Charles, can we go back to you? I want to ask you this question. Is it likely that the British government will now have to think again about its foreign policy, its security policy? Isn't a weak British government not really in much of a position to go around the world threatening other people, bombing other people, invading other people? Is that one of the silver linings, perhaps, in this cloud?
You've still got Britain, still, regardless of governments over the last few years, tied, and this is a point that Corbyn brought up as well in the election, tied in their foreign policies, not to our own national interests, but the interests to other countries that are very rich in the Gulf, for example, Saudi Arabia, and of course Qatar. And hence the irony that you have at this present moment in time, a dispute between those two countries, where Britain, of course, gets a third of its imported gas from Qatar, half of its arms exports go to Saudi Arabia, and of course also, Britain's relationship, regardless of which party's in power, with Israel. And those three countries behind the scenes pulling many of the strings of British foreign policy. And I feel, at least from my observations, and I've predicted this and it seems to be coming true, that Trump himself is also being pulled in those directions. And so whether we see a change or not will remains to be seen. But notably, when it was revealed after the Manchester bombings that of the links between the bomber and his associates, the Algerian Islamic fighting groups, for example, that Britain sponsored and supported along with France to overthrow Gaddafi, the revelations that were carried largely in online media, but nonetheless indisputable revelations that MI5 and MI6 had actually conspired to, as people like myself have talked about for many years, to actually assist British jihadists and so on, they call themselves jihadist extremists, to actually, even in one case, people on a control order that MI5 had said they needed to control terrorists, actually allowing or facilitating those people to travel to places like Libya and Syria to fight against so-called British enemies like Assad and Gaddafi. And then, of course, notwithstanding that there's going to be blowback in terms of terrorism. And that, again, did not make almost any of the mainstream media. And this comes back to the point we just mentioned as well. I would make this point finally for myself, that largely, why do people vote the way they do? Okay, the mainstream media is in decline, but they still, as you both mentioned, they still carry a lot of weight. And unfortunately, a lot of people vote the way they do because they are told by certain sections of the mainstream media, and passively, even as you suggested earlier, by the BBC, to vote in a certain way. And that is why foreign policy and its links with terrorism still remains something that's generally elusive in the minds of most people, but it's definitely there.
I told you in French earlier that some things change, but other things always remain the same. And as a summary, Charles Shoebridge has just made that very point. But the British election shows that if a leader shows leadership and captures the zeitgeist, as Corbyn undoubtedly has, particularly amongst young people, everything can change. They are, after all, singing his name at Glastonbury Festival, not anybody else's. It's been marvellous from me and I hope that you enjoyed it too. Thank you very much.